So welcome everyone. I'm Allison Butcher. I'm with the Master Builders Association of King and Snohomish counties. We are members of the Coalition for More Housing Choices, and I'm pleased to be here to moderate today's roundtable. We are recording the roundtable so we can share with those who can't join us live today. And so for those who don't know, the Coalition formed in 2019. We're a broad spectrum of Puget Sound leaders, organizations, businesses, and nonprofits, all concerned about housing. We have a very full program today, so I will, in the interest of time, I'll drop a link in the chat so you can learn more about the Coalition and encourage you to check that out. But one of the things we do is put on virtual roundtables like this one, featuring policy experts, lawmakers, and housing advocates. And we also put out regular e-briefs, twice a month emails about housing, and you can learn about upcoming programs like this or other news on housing. And we put together local housing data snapshots, more on that coming later this year, and we engage in high-level advocacy on priority policymaking. By coming together as a coalition, we recognize that the topic of housing is so important, and advocating for change requires more than any one organization can do alone. And really, it's fitting to think about this year of housing in Olympia, as it's been called, which came together thanks to really a wide range of stakeholders. And that included coalition members, but many others who came together and lobbied for positive change. And just a reminder of the positive results that can be achieved by working together. So really appreciate the work of just a broad cross-section of stakeholders on housing, and it was hard to narrow down to just three for today's roundtable, but we, in the interest of time, had to narrow it down to three. So here we are. And I'm just moving on in my slides. And welcome if you're just joining us. Going to get started, and let's see, there we go. So do you see, let's see, hold on. Just doing a check. Clay, what slide do I have up right now? Is that just the intro slide? Okay, here, I think this is what do you see the participants for today?
It's got the Coalition for More Housing Choices slide.
I'm missing one. Well, in any case, this is how you can sign up for the newsletter. And again, I'll drop this in the chat as well. Sorry about that. Getting used to my slides here, and just really excited for our roundtable panelists and topics. We have Clay White with LDC will be first up, and he's going to discuss permit streamlining legislation, SB 5290. And then following Clay, we'll have Dan Bertolet with Sightline Institute. We'll present on the middle housing bill, HB 1110. And then we'll round out the program today with Bambi Chávez with Housing Development Consortium of Seattle, King County, and she'll share thoughts on the Covenant Homeownership Account Act, HB 1474. It's a key priority of the Black Home Initiative policy framework. So kicking things off first will be Clay White, and welcome, Clay. Just for those who don't know, Clay serves as the Director of Planning with LDC Inc. And LDC is a full-service land use consulting firm offering civil engineering, GIS, property feasibility studies, as well as land use planning and permitting services. And prior to LDC, Clay spent 16 years serving cities and counties throughout Washington State as a land use planner, including over 5 years as Planning and Development Services Director for Snohomish County. He has extensive knowledge and experience with land use permitting. So great to have him here today talking about this legislation. I will also mention it's important to note he led a project team for Department of Commerce for the Collaborative Roadmap Phase 3 project. And this is the effort that was called for by the legislature, in which a task force was convened last year to make recommendations regarding needed reforms to the state's growth policy framework. As I understand it, that includes recommendations for permit streamlining that are reflected in SB 5290. So delighted to have you with us, Clay. And just a reminder, you can log questions in the chat as we go today. We will try our best to get to questions as time allows, but I am going to stop my screen share now and turn it over to Clay. So thanks everyone for joining us. Really appreciate you being here.
Great. Thank you, Allison. It's wonderful to be here. As Allison mentioned, my name is Clay White. I'm the Director of Planning with LDC. And our firm does civil engineering, surveying, and planning throughout the state of Washington. And we've got offices in Olympia and Kent and Woodinville, and been serving the community for 20 years now. So lucky to be a part of this organization. And as part of my work, as Allison mentioned, we led the collaborative roadmap project. And as part of that, 5290, which we're going to talk about now, was one of the recommendations from the task force that was developed as part of that project. So I was lucky enough to help write good portions of this bill in coordination with our project task force. So we're going to go through three things today. I thought that we'd talk a little bit about, so 5290 really impacts the Local Project Review Act, which is permit processes and timelines and data reporting, all of those things that, I think that I've been in planning for almost 25 years, and we've been talking about those things since I've been in planning. So we're going to talk a little bit about the statute background, like why do we have the Local Project Review Act, the problem that this bill was attempting to solve, and then kind of some key elements of the bill. So just for a little bit of background, the planning, this legislation really stems from the Growth Management Act. So, 3670B, which was altered as part of this bill, implements Goal 7 of the Growth Management Act. And there's 14 goals within the Growth Management Act, but one of them is permits. And it says that applications for both state and local permits should be processed in a timely and fair manner to ensure predictability. So a lot of you may not know that that's in there, but that's actually one of the main goals of the Growth Management Act, is to ensure that as you're adding new regulations and process, that you can still process permits in that timely and fair manner. Now, about 5 years after the Growth Management came into effect, they said, hey, this is increasing the number of permits and process. And while it accomplishes many good things, we're also seeing it impact, how permits are processed and being able to get housing to market faster. So this is where RCW 3670B, the Local Project Review Act, came in to be. There was a process called regulatory reform. And so in 1995, the legislature created this statute. So it had a number of goals. The legislature found that as the number of environmental laws and development regulations has increased for land uses and development, so has the number of required local land use permits, each with their own separate approval process. And that the increasing number of local, state, and land use permits and separate environmental review processes required by agencies has generated continuing potential for conflict, overlap, duplication between various permit and review processes. So those things were, found by the legislature in 1995, even though that we're still talking about many of those things today. So really the purpose for the Local Project Review Act was that the statute set up a process for permit application reviews, ways to consolidate permit processes. So like you can do a subdivision and a rezone at the same time, and how would that happen? How many days do you issue a notice to the public for an application? What kind of things need to go to a hearing? And it set expectations for also permit data collection for some jurisdiction. The goal was to try and provide consistency across jurisdictions and maintain reasonable permit timelines as planning requirements increase. Now, that's a pretty big challenge because you've got this state law and you have all of these jurisdictions that are implementing the language in different ways. So, what's the problem that was trying to be addressed with 5290? Well, I think what we found was the main themes were consistency and accountability. And these are issues that have been discussed for the last 20 years. So it would be issues like permit timeline requirements by cities not being met. We've had this 120-day clock that was in the statute. but nothing happens on day 121. Further, while some projects, it may be appropriate for it to take 120 days for a local government to process that application. For some permits, maybe it should be a shorter period of time. It puts everything in one bucket. There was things with, there's requirements in the statute for a notice of application to be issued within 14 days after completeness. Often that's not happening. And local governments have also interpreted in different ways the process to determine the completeness of an application. When is it procedurally complete so that you then start reviewing it in a substantive way? And so that's been interpreted differently by different cities. So that's been an issue that's come up quite a bit. And then there's permit data reporting for 7 counties and the cities within those counties with a population over 20,000. So that would be King, Pierce, Snohomish, Whatcom, Kitsap, Thurston, and Clark. And there's been this process where they've been required to report permit timelines and data since, I think, 2001, but there's only, out of over 40 jurisdictions subject to this requirement, I think there's been 1 or 2 that have consistently done that. Permit data is really important because it allows those that are building in different communities to have an understanding about how things are going. And you can think about, like, just as we talk to the legislature about permitting or housing issues, if you had data, you could try to fix problems, but it hasn't been available. So that's been an issue as well. So, the issue was taken up as part of the collaborative roadmap, and, the bill really reflects the recommendations from that group. So I'm going to talk about 2 different things. Basically, how does 5290 address the GMA requirements for timely and fair permit processes to ensure predictability, and the requirement for permit timeline data, so it is better understood how long it takes to process various project permit applications. So let's talk about permit data first. So focused on making the process simpler but accountable. So the way that the statute was written previously, there was a lot of data that needed to be collected by cities and counties. It was pretty difficult language to understand and collect that information. I mean, it could have been written more clearly. And so really the focus in these revisions was simplify the amount of data that the cities and counties have to collect, but make it accountable. And so it's really been whittled down to that cities have to provide information on the amount of time it takes to process applications like preliminary subdivisions, final subdivisions, binding site plans, permit processes associated with multifamily housing, and construction plan review for each of these types of permits. What's really new is that once they collect this permit data, the way it was under the previous statutory language was they would just post this report on their website. So if you're interested in knowing how long it takes to get a permit, you got to scour our website, try to find it. What's new is that they will take this data and then they'll send it to the Department of Commerce, who's going to publish a report annually. So their cities will collect this data, send it to Commerce by March 1st, who will then publish a report by, I think, June or July 1st of each year. And so you'll be able to get a report. How long does it take? And it should be a lot more useful information. So that's kind of the gist of the permit data requirements. There's also, if they're not producing these reports, you're going to know about it. And there could be some consequences with cities and counties being able to get Growth Management Act grants if they're not following through on this process. The next piece, big piece, was permit process. And so, there was a lot of reforms within 5290. It clarifies that you calculate days for an application by counting every day. So, I mean, there's little things like jurisdictions were counting, how long they have an application in their possession differently in different jurisdictions. It also clarifies what procedural completeness for a project permit application means. So this is really important. So when you turn in an application, before they start reviewing it, they have to determine whether it's procedurally complete. And some jurisdictions were following kind of the letter of the law and making a determination based upon kind of what the statute set out. Others were requiring some type of substantive review before they would determine the application complete. So the statute now says if the procedural submission requirements as outlined on the project permit application have been provided, the need for additional information or other studies may not preclude a completeness determination. So this means that within 28 days, if you turn in everything that's on their application form, they are required to determine it complete. It reemphasizes that the notice of application shall be provided within 14 days after the determination of completeness. So once they determine it complete, they should be getting a notice of application out when that's required. It also replaces the 120-day clock with 3 different permit buckets. So it states that for project permits which do not require public notice, the target timeline is 65 days from the determination of completeness. For projects that require public notice, it's 100 days. For project permits which require public notice and a public hearing, it would be 170 days. And this is kind of a baseline for local governments to be able to utilize. Jurisdictions have the ability to modify the above timelines, but if they don't take any action, it would automatically default to these timelines. So if they don't want to implement this bill, then you'll use these days. And the nice thing is if a city or county wants to take longer for certain type of permits, they're going to have to take that to a hearing and take that to their legislative body, and it will provide an opportunity for stakeholders to provide public comment and make sure that those timelines are correct. So it also provides a lot more clarity in the statute about when the clock, so when those days count and when they don't. So it provides a lot more surety to applicants and to local government of when they count days and when they don't, so it's easier to keep track of. So it says any period between the day that the county and city has notified the applicant in writing that additional information is required to further process the application and the day when responsive information is resubmitted by the applicant. So those would be the days that aren't being counted, and that wasn't in the statute before. So the biggest thing is the accountability. So when a local government does not meet their established timeframes, this means that a portion of permit fees are going to be returned. It would be 10% if the final decision on a project permit application was made after the applicable deadline, but the period from the passage of the deadline to the time of final issuance did not exceed 20% of the original time period. So if it only exceeds 20%, you get 10% of your fees. If it goes over that, then you would get 20% of your fees. And as the task force was evaluating this, it wasn't supposed to be some type of punitive type of damages. You're not trying to take these fees away from cities and counties. But the main thought process was if there's not some accountability, if there's not any accountability, then it's no different than the 120-day clock now, that there's it's a standard that will be in there, but what happens when it's not met? And so to even kind of further bolster that this is not meant to be kind of a punitive issue against cities and counties, especially if they're short-staffed or they lose staff or something. If jurisdictions take certain measures, then they're exempt from this requirement. So if they proactively take certain measures like expedited permit program, or they have an interlocal with other jurisdictions for services when staffing levels change, or they maintain a budget for on-call services, or they have positions budgeted that are contingent on revenue increases so they can hire faster if they see a spike in permits, or if they adopt codes that only require hearings for permits that are statutorily required. There's a list of things that they can do. And if they take 3 of these actions, then it'll show that they're really attempting to keep up with permit processes and be exempt from having to return permit fees. There is a provision in the bill also that says, hey, if those provisions don't work, then you got to go back and re-adopt some new measures. For both pieces of the legislation, they go into effect on January 1st, 2025. So that means cities and counties will start collecting permit data in 2024, so they can turn it in 2025. 2025 is when the new permit process requirements go into effect. And that, I don't want to lessen, this is a big set of code changes and process changes for some cities and counties. And so giving them the time to be able to enact this properly will be really important. There's also quite a bit in the bill about, grant programs that for technical assistance from Commerce that will be there. There's a study that will be conducted to see if it may be advantageous for the state to have a permit tracking software. So as you know, you might, if you're turning in permit applications, you might work with 5, 6, 7 different permit software systems for different jurisdictions. And what would it look like if the state had one portal? Or if those that don't have permit software, those very small jurisdictions, if they had an option to be able to use one kind of permit software, what would that look like and gain efficiency? So there's a number of those things in the bill. I think this is probably a good place for me to stop, Allison, and take questions now or at the end, basically how you'd like to set it up.
Thank you, Clay. And I realized there was an issue with attendees not being able to view you during your presentation, see you, but hopefully they should see you now. I think we may have corrected that, so apologies. So let's just start. Are there any questions before we move on? Thank you, Clay, for your presentation. I know there's a lot of pieces to the permit streamlining, and I know it hasn't gotten as much attention as some other bills in the media. And so it's a great opportunity to hear from you as to how this may all play out. But any questions before we move on for Clay? Okay, and I know. Next up, we have Dan Bertolet, and I will be elevating Dan to co-host as well. So bear with me. My apologies for technical difficulties, but anyway, we just delighted to have Dan with us. He is director of Sightline Institute's Housing and Urbanism program, and he's passionate about creating cities that welcome people of all incomes and tread lightly on the planet. And HB 1110 really promises to do both. So he's been a great advocate for housing and a great partner, and also a regular speaker at our roundtable. So we're delighted to have Dan. And Dan, I will be working to elevate you. Dan, do you have any slides for us today that you'll be?
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn it over to you and simultaneously work to hopefully attendees can view you speaking. But obviously a lot of excitement around the middle housing bill, and it is a big change for our state. So would love to hear your thoughts and talking about the advocacy that Sightline and many others did on behalf of this legislation, and really looking forward to hearing from you. So I'll turn it over to you right now. Thank you, Dan.
Okay, thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. I don't know if you can see me, but I don't know if you want to see me. I'm Dan Bertolet with Sightline. Sightline's a public policy research center based in Seattle. We have about 20 staff, and our mission is to make the Pacific Northwest a global model of sustainability. And this year happens to be our 30th anniversary, so yay us. As you all know, it was a big year for housing abundance bills in Washington. And, really, I think it's seriously hard to overstate what a total sea change it was for state level action to create more housing choices this year. And so here's the short story. The biggest win was HB 1110, the middle housing bill. And that bill in most Washington cities legalizes duplexes and fourplexes and up to sixplexes near transit, or if 2 of the units are affordable. And I know I was asked to focus on the middle housing bill, but I also want to talk about HB 1337, the ADU bill, because really it's almost as big a win. It legalizes 2 accessory dwelling units per lot and loosens a whole bunch of other restrictions, and it applies to lots on all city and county land and urban growth areas. And just a little more on the big year, on top of those 2 big wins, legislators passed about a half dozen narrower bills And so we had bills that make it easier to add housing to existing buildings, that develop better building codes for apartments, that speed up permitting, as Clay just talked about, that reform environmental and design review processes, and that support construction of small scale condos. So it's really pretty much a housing abundance laundry list coming to fruition in Washington state law. And it all adds up to just a huge step forward to create more homes that more people can afford, to undo segregation, to create lower carbon communities, and to hold back sprawl for decades to come now. So the longer story is, it took 5 legislative sessions to get to this big year. And for Sightline, it started in 2019 when we teamed up with Rep. Mia Gregerson to run the state's first ADU reform bill. And that bill didn't live long, but we kept at it. And over the next 3 legislative sessions, we worked on more bills to legalize middle housing and ADUs. But the legislature only managed to pass 2 relatively narrow bills. One bill that lifted parking mandates for ADUs a quarter mile from transit, and one bill that struck down limits on the number of unrelated people allowed to live together. But then in this last legislative session, the dam finally burst. And that's sort of no exaggeration. There's kind of no one simple reason why things went well so well this year. There are a bunch of factors that sort of combined to, I don't know, to form a perfect storm, you might say. First, just over the years, more and more people have been feeling the housing crisis, right? It's directly or indirectly. It's only been getting worse, and people are talking about it all over the place. Second, there's been more and more agreement that a housing shortage is the core problem, and that zoning reform is a key fix for that problem. Third, we were so lucky to have incredibly strong legislator champions, notably Representative Jessica Bateman and Mia Gregerson. Fourth, we worked with Republicans, and all of the abundant housing bills passed with strong bipartisan votes. Fifth, we had a stronger, bigger coalition, as Allison was mentioning. Things were pretty lonely back when we started this work in 2019, but this year the coalition was broader and more active than ever. And lastly, housing rose to such a high priority this year that the House Democrats actually reorganized their housing and local government committees to better handle these kinds of zoning reform bills. So that's the rundown of at least my take on why things went so well this year. Next, I want to get into a quick rundown of what the bills actually do. And first up, the Middle Housing Bill, HB 1110. So in cities with populations of 75,000 or more, it legalizes 4 homes per residential lot and 6 per lot within a quarter mile of a major transit stop, or if 2 of the homes are affordable. And the bill's definition of a major transit stop is limited to rail and bus rapid transit. It doesn't include regular bus stops. Okay, in cities with less than 75,000 but more than 25,000, it legalizes 2 homes per lot and 4 per lot within a quarter mile of a transit stop, or if one of the homes is affordable. And then in cities with populations under 25,000 that are located within the state's largest metros, it legalizes 2 homes per lot. Couple more notes on the bill. The cities can also comply by authorizing those allowances on 3/4 of their residential land or lots. But that's subject to a bunch of limitations on the parcels that can be included or excluded from that 75%. And then cities have, they have to comply with the bill within 6 months of completing their next comprehensive plan update. And for cities in the Puget Sound region, that means roughly mid-2025. And it's in later years for most other parts of the state. Okay, so I know that's a lot, but I want to keep going, and I want to give a quick rundown of the ADU bill also. And so the ADU bill, HB 1337, in both cities and unincorporated county land. And that's one difference between the ADU bill and the middle housing bill is the middle housing bill only applies to cities. ADU bill also applies to unincorporated county land, all within urban growth areas. So the ADU bill, it prohibits owner occupancy requirements. It legalizes 2 ADUs per lot and in any configuration of attached or detached. It caps impact fees at 50% of what's charged on a house. It lifts parking mandates on ADUs within a half mile of a transit stop with 15-minute service. So that includes bus stops. It legalizes ADUs on any lot size that's legal for a detached house. So essentially no minimum lot size. It sets a minimum ADU size of at least 1,000 square feet. And it loosens a bunch of other stuff that you can get into the details if you look up the bill. And last thing is it has the same compliance schedule as the middle housing bill. And one reason I said the ADU bill is almost as big a win as the middle housing bill is that in cities where the middle housing bill only legalizes 2 homes per lot, the ADU bill actually legalizes 3. So I think a lot of people don't realize that. Okay, like I said, I know I just ran through a lot of information. You didn't have any slides to look at. And I see, I don't know if I should stop, Allison. I see there's a comment, a question in the chat. And
Let's see. I'm not sure I've seen a comment or a question.
Oh, it went directly to me. Oops. So
Okay.
maybe we should save that for the end, or for later in the Q&A. Okay, and I'm going to keep going here. Like I said, I know that I ran down those bills quickly, and happy to talk about any details in the Q&A. So next, I wanted to just talk about like what might we expect to happen now that these bills have passed. What would change on the ground look like? And based on housing reforms passed in Oregon and California and Portland and other cities, we know that change won't come overnight. It will be incremental. Neighborhoods will change gradually. But to put some rough numbers on it, the latest official estimate from Commerce says that Washington needs to produce about 55,000 homes per year on average to meet future demand. And that's about 10,000 more than the current rate. So under the status quo, every year, we would expect to fall behind by another 10,000 homes. So the Puget Sound Regional Council projects that the middle housing bill could yield in the mid-range of their estimate about 4,500 additional homes per year in the Puget Sound region alone. And then based on data from California after they passed ADU reform similar to our ADU bill, we might expect Washington's ADU bill to boost production by about 2,000 homes per year. So add those up, and the upshot is that we can be fairly confident that over time, these bills will take a big bite out of the state's 10,000 per year gap. I wanted to finish up here by just mentioning some other bills that were in play this year that didn't pass. And the bills that did pass, middle housing and ADUs, are definitely huge wins, but at the same time, we shouldn't expect those kinds of relatively low density housing types to completely solve the housing shortage. And one big housing abundance piece that's still missing is legalizing larger apartment buildings near frequent transit. And this session, we had a great TOD bill that passed the Senate, amazingly, in strong form, but then hit the wall in the House. And we expect to see a bill like that back again next year. And then we also had a bill to legalize lot splitting. That is to create lots for smaller, less expensive houses. And that bill passed the House almost unanimously, but then died in the Senate. So we expect that we'll have that bill back again next year too. And then one last critical piece is parking. Because as we all know, excessive parking mandates undermine all types of housing. And it's kind of interesting, based on our experience so far working in the Washington legislature, passing a parking reform bill may end up being an even heavier political lift than legalizing middle housing. This year, we had the state's first standalone parking bill. That bill didn't live long, but Sightline is boosting our efforts on parking reform for the 2024 session. And the middle housing bill has caps on parking mandates. It caps them at 1 per unit. But you can imagine that trying to build a fourplex on a small lot and having to find space for 4 parking spots could be problematic. So we think we need to push harder on reducing parking mandates statewide. And so, yeah, there's more to do, but like I said, it's hard to overstate the significance of this year's wins. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. We had one quick question I was hoping you could address, and then we're going to turn over to Bambi. But asking about the ADU bill and the bill number, and as I understand it, that was 1337.
Right.
The question is about just clarifying about owner occupancy. Does this mean any ADU statewide can now be leased, even if the owner is not living in the primary house or vice versa?
Yes, that is correct.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dan. I am now going to. Let's see. I need to elevate Bambi to host so we can see her. And thank you, Dan. Bambi, welcome, and so glad to have you with us. And quick introduction, Bambi is the Homeownership Policy Coordinator at Housing Development Consortium, Seattle King County. In this role, Bambi stewards HDC's approach to addressing disparities in and access to and retention of homeownership by broadening HDC's participation in the Black Home Initiative. And she helps coordinate a coherent strategy around a collective policy agenda that will elevate the policy framework needed to deliver and sustain homeownership opportunities in the Puget Sound region. The Black Home Initiative is a new regional effort that seeks to address racial inequities in housing with the goal of increasing homeownership among Black households. And they have set a goal to create 1,500 new low and moderate income Black households to own a home in South Seattle, South King County, and North Pierce County within the next 5 years. They accomplished their work through having partners in the network, and the Coalition for More Housing Choices is proud to be part of that network. So I am going to turn it over to Bambi to talk about the Covenant Homeownership Account Program Act, legislation that passed this session. So, and you have your slides up. I can see them. So thank you, Bambi. I'll have you take it away.
Excellent. And I hope you all can hear me. So good morning. I'm very excited to be speaking to you today about the Covenant Homeownership Account and Program Act, also known as CHAP. The passage of CHAP during the 2023 legislative session represented groundbreaking change for housing justice, and it was an honor to be a part of that process. Before I begin to talk about CHAP, it's important for you to understand how HDC, Black Home Initiative Network, and CHAP are related. As Allison mentioned, HDC, like the Coalition for More Housing Choices, is a Black Home Initiative Network partner. Like all partners, we are committed to the BHI goal of 1,500 new first-time low to moderate income households owning a home by July of 2027. The work of achieving this goal falls into 3 areas of effort: increasing the supply of homes available, meeting the supply with mortgage-ready potential homeowners, and ensuring the success of everyone's efforts through community engagement and aligned actions. HDC leads the effort to create the policy enabling environment that will be necessary to achieve our BHI goal. We do this by connecting the dots between the information in the policy environment and the knowledge of community stakeholders and organizations. We create momentum and grow the network by developing relationships within and between these groups around policy goals. We aim for one concrete policy win each year and look at the work as a multi-year process. However, before we can lead advocacy and mobilization, we must first understand what policies will further the BHI goal. To this effect, HDC convened the BHI policy group to determine which policy actions would most effectively increase Black homeownership. The result of that 5-month process was the BHI Homeownership Policy Framework. The framework is a list of city, county, and state level policy actions that will move the needle on the zoning and regulatory reform, cost reduction, land acquisition and value capture, and the funding actions necessary for change. The Covenant Homeownership Account and Program Act was included within the framework, and in fact, so are many other bills that were just talked about by Dan. And that was a policy action that addressed funding, the Covenant Homeownership Account and Program Act, but it also addressed so much more. While HDC was convening the policy group to delineate the homeownership policy framework, we also convened a 50-person work group to prepare the Covenant bill for the 2023 legislative session. Community and organizational stakeholders worked with the bill sponsors and other interested legislative advocates to determine ways to overcome the barriers to homeownership created by the covenants. This 5-month process resulted in many ideas for action and ultimately produced the Covenant Homeownership Account bill that went forward. It cannot be overstated that this was a very unique process. Often a bill happens because legislators receive input from policy champions or colleagues, but having such wide stakeholder engagement over such an extended period of time is not the norm. By taking the time to build solutions together, we set up the bill for strong support within the legislature and outside of the legislature. In public hearings for the bill, more than 2,000 people signed in pro. There were 40+ people who provided more than 3 hours of public testimony. The bill called for housing justice, and that call was answered by supporters far and wide. But this call for justice had actually begun much earlier in 2022. During the 2022 legislative session, HB 1335 was passed, and that bill laid the foundation for the Covenant Homeownership Account bill. HB 1335 funded the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project at the University of Washington and Eastern Washington University. The project works to identify and map racial restrictions buried in property records that prevented people who were not white from buying or occupying property. These restrictions were promoted and registered by state and local governments and were used to segregate cities and sometimes exclude people from entire communities. Only 1 year into the study, more than 50,000 restricted properties in hundreds of neighborhoods across the state of Washington have been documented. These restrictions occurred in every area of our state. These maps on the screen now show a sample of the restricted areas in Seattle and King County. But if you go to the website for the study, they have several interactive mapping tools that can help you understand the extent of these practices throughout the state. Racially restrictive covenants, in conjunction with policies and practices such as redlining, mortgage subsidies and incentives, and displacement and gentrification, have created the extreme homeownership gap we see in our state today. In Washington state, the white homeownership rate is 71%, more than 2 times the Black homeownership rate of 31%. The Covenant Account and Program Act is designed to help close this gap. Through CHAP, the state government will enact a $100 document recording assessment for each real estate transaction and then use the revenues to provide first-time homebuyers affected by the state's discriminatory housing policies and practices with their down payment and closing costs. Restrictive covenants were recorded by the state through the document recording process, and it is fitting that this same process should help remedy the harm created by decades of discrimination. To identify through evidence-based documentation the persons that require assistance, a Covenant Homeownership Program study will be completed by the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. Washington State Housing Finance Commission will also administer and establish a special purpose credit program, or an SPCP, to extend special purpose credit to the eligible applicants. This will be the first time that a government agency has utilized a special purpose credit program. And this is a really big deal. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed to stop housing discrimination. In 1974, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed to stop credit discrimination. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act created special purpose credit programs so that financial institutions could develop race-conscious programs to remedy the harm that they had caused through racial discrimination. These race-conscious programs work because they are removing the structural barriers that persist from discriminatory practices. And now Washington State Housing Finance Commission will be the first in the nation government agency to use a race-conscious program to remove the structural barriers caused by decades of racial housing discrimination by state and local government. A Covenant Homeownership Program study will be completed by March of 2024 to determine which people were discriminated against through racial covenants, and then those people from those affected populations will become eligible for assistance when they meet other requirements. And the other requirements are that they must have an income at or below 100% of the area median income. They must be a first-time home buyer. They must have been a Washington State resident who was a resident before the enactment of the Fair Housing Act, or was or would have been excluded from homeownership by a racially restrictive covenant on or before April of 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was passed. For good or for bad, homeownership is the cornerstone of the American dream. It is the primary way households build wealth, stability, and community, and pass wealth down to future generations. But access to homeownership has not been evenly distributed. The result of this persistent discrimination is that the net worth of a white family is 10 times that of a Black family. With the passage of CHAP, Washington State, who was both an active and a passive participant in this discrimination, can begin to address these disparities. On Monday, May 8th, the Covenant Homeownership Account and Program Act became law in Washington State. 100 plus stakeholders and community members were on hand to witness this historic bill signing at the Northwest African American Museum. Governor Jay Inslee declared, "It is a great anti-racism day for the state of Washington," and there was palpable joy in the room. We are so appreciative of the efforts of the bill's sponsors, Representative Jamila Taylor and Senator John Lovick. We also have tremendous gratitude for Representative Frank Chop, the bill's instigator and #1 champion. So what are the next steps? By March 1 of 2024, the Washington State Housing Finance Commission will complete the first homeownership program study, and then an updated study will be completed at least every 5 years. By October 1 of 2023, the Department of Financial Institutions will form a Covenant Homeownership Oversight Committee. And the plan is that assistance will begin for eligible applicants on July 1, 2024. Now that down payment and closing cost assistance can be provided, we need to ensure that there is a supply of homes for purchase, and that is going to take capital and pre-development funding. So we will be mobilizing for a budget ask for the 2024 legislative session to continue this important work. The process of engaging stakeholders will begin again around 2024 advocacy, and we're going to probably begin that in July. So please do stay informed by receiving the weekly BHI Network Policy Digest, and reach out to me if you would like to be a part of this future work. Thank you for spending this time with me to learn about the Covenant Homeownership Account and Program Act, one of the most significant laws created in the Washington State Legislature in 2023. I'll put my contact information and the digest sync up link, the sign up link there in the chat. And then that way you can stay connected.
Great.
I hope my screen is ended. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bambi, for that presentation and walking us through all really the process that led us here. And actually, that was also something so striking to me is that a new idea can be introduced and passed in one legislative session. That is so unusual to have that happen for any issue or any piece of legislation. So really noteworthy there. And definitely want to encourage. I want to encourage anyone who wants to stay in touch with the work of the Black Home Initiative policy framework to follow your digest that you mentioned, and you have the sign up link there. Thank you for that. I also would do a plug for Dan Bertolet. I know is active on Twitter and posts a lot of great information about housing topics and Sightline's great work there as well. So I encourage you to look up Dan on Twitter if you're not already following him there. And so at this time, are there any questions for Bambi and her presentation, or I would say any of our speakers and topics today? If so, please throw them in the chat. We love to take this opportunity to answer any questions. But I know Bambi, a lot of work continues. We'll be continuing in the interim on as we talk about implementation. You talked about next steps, and also fair to say that the policy framework group will be continuing to meet and talking about additional steps to further the goals of the BHI. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the policy group that was formed continues to meet, and so we meet monthly. We'll go through a process of learning about what's kind of coming down the pipeline for 2024 and figuring out where to put our advocacy. As you saw on the framework slide, there are local, city, county, and state level actions. So there is activity occurring in the moment and planned for the future. And then there's the activity we're not quite sure about yet until we start to see sponsors chiming in about what's going to happen over the interim, but we'll be very much involved. So if people were also interested in joining in that BHI Network policy group, it's a monthly group in which you'll be able to really express your opinions about moving forward and contribute.
Thank you, Bambi. And again, I encourage everyone. Earlier in the chat, I put the sign up link for the coalition's e-brief. It's a twice monthly email, and so definitely encourage you to sign up if you have not already, as a way to stay in touch with the coalition's work. Really want to take this time to thank Dan, Bambi, and Clay for joining us today and talking about this legislation. There was just a lot of activity this session, but really more work ahead as we shift to the implementation side at the local level. The work doesn't stop, so we're going to continue to roll up our sleeves and work together as a coalition, and just appreciate everyone's interest and engagement and for joining us today. Last call for questions in the chat, but I apologize for the video hiccup today, and not that's me not being nimble enough and didn't realize I needed to assign host duties to our speakers to see them. So apologies for that hiccup today, but I think you could at least hear our presenters. Appreciate you being here. We will also be placing, we'll create a video from today, and we'll include that in our upcoming e-brief. So for anyone, if you want to revisit the presentations, or for anyone who had to miss today, I know it's a busy time with meeting conflicts and even summer travel schedule starting. So thank you again, everyone. I think with that, we're going to end a few minutes early. So I'll give everyone a few minutes back to their day. But thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.